Now, during the course of the webinar, if any questions come up for you, please write them in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the slide presentation. And with that, I will hand it over to Lauren Draper.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you all for having me. Thank you so much to the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns and for Thomas for putting this together. I'm really, really proud to be here today and excited to discuss and hopefully share the knowledge I've learned so that you can feel more informed about this crisis that's happening in Israel and in Gaza and in the West Bank. As a little bit of background, my name is Lauren. I was raised in Kansas with a very minimal understanding of the Middle East, but felt very called during my years at university in the UK to pursue a knowledge of Arabic and of Muslim and Christian relations. And so while I have a background in relational ministry, I have been now living in Jerusalem for the last year, working alongside Churches for Middle East Peace. So I serve as our Middle East Fellow, and I am I'm usually based in East Jerusalem. I'm currently in Europe due to the crisis. But if you are familiar with Jerusalem, I live about 10 minutes north of the Damascus Gate of the Old City. So I'm really in the heart of the city. And I've totally fallen in love with Israel and with Palestine in my time there. So I'm excited to get to share these people that I love with you. And hopefully you will walk away feeling like you understand this crisis a little bit more, but also feeling empowered that you can do something about what's happening right now. So today I'm going to discuss the horrific events of October 7th, but I'm also then going to expand into a contextualization of the larger events. I want to talk about what has occurred then since the initial attacks and the actions that we as American citizens can take to call our government to take action. I want to say before I begin that there's a lot of history in this conflict, a lot of history relating to Israel and Palestine. And I don't have time in the next hour to summarize 100 years of history. At CMEP, we've put together a curriculum that you can look into, that you can take alongside your community if you're interested in knowing more about what happened from the Balfour Declaration over 100 years ago to the crisis we are in now. And I really encourage you to do that. But I do want to sort of clarify some of the misunderstandings that this sort of conflict has been happening for 2,000 years, or that it's entirely based in religion, or that there's nothing we can do to stop the loss of innocent civilian lives. So I'm excited to share with you a little bit more about the region and about this recent history. I also want to make clear right from the start that this is not a situation of one side versus another. It's not black and white. And to be against bigotry, to stand against anti-Semitism, does not mean you cannot stand against Islamophobia and anti-Arab or anti-Palestinian sentiment. And it doesn't make you fluffy to stand by all of those things at one time. It makes you strong and bold right now. So I really encourage you to contemplate that as we walk through these slides. And I welcome any questions you might have on them. So we're going to begin with the catastrophic events of October 7th. As you've probably seen, because this event has been all over the international media, the horrific events were the deadliest in Israel's history since it was founded in 1948. Air raid sirens sounded throughout Jerusalem, where I lived, around 6:30 a.m. and again throughout the day, all day of October 7th. They sounded in the central belt of Israel, which is somewhat unusual. It's not unusual for these rockets to be sent out of the Gaza Strip. What is unusual is the sheer amount and the distance that these rockets were shot and launched. Hamas claims that 5,000 rockets were launched during this time, but Israel is estimating that it's closer to 2,200, which is still a huge amount. We also saw Hamas gunmen enter Israel during this time and slaughter over 1,000 civilians. 1,100 people were killed, including Israelis and foreign nationals. At the time, it was estimated that about 100 hostages were taken. These were both Israelis and foreign nationals. And around 10 o'clock that day, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared, "We are at war." Hamas, slightly earlier, prior to this declaration, had declared that they had started what they were calling the Al-Aqsa flood in order to defend Al-Aqsa, to stop the atrocities in Gaza against the Palestinian people and our holy sites. You've probably heard these events already recounted, but I'd like to further explain a little bit of what's meaning and where this came from. We saw the UN chief in Palestine recently say these events did not happen in a vacuum. And so I want to talk about what that means and sort of the events surrounding this catastrophe. So I'm going to begin with a sort of simplified timeline of the recent history of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, beginning in 1948. This is often known as the 1948 War or the War of Israeli Independence. But to Palestinians, this is called the Nakba, or the catastrophe. This is because in 1948, Palestinians were displaced from their homes in central Israel, what is now central Israel. Prior to this event, it had been called British Mandate Palestine, and that ran along almost all of what you would say is modern-day Palestine and Israel. This is where the British were ruling over the Jewish peoples and the Palestinian peoples who were living in this land. But in 1948, the Israeli military, as we call it now, but then it was not officially Israel, but the military swept through, and the Palestinians who were living in the Central Belt were pushed to major Palestinian centers. They might not have been big cities, but they were sort of Palestinian centers. So for the West Bank, that was Ramallah, and a lot of people from Ramallah were coming from the outskirts of Jerusalem or from central Israel. And those who went to Gaza were also coming from kind of southern Israel, central Israel. And you see these people living in refugee status for the next 20 years, as Gaza is sort of governed by the country of Egypt. In 1967, the next war happened, known as the 6 Days War, or known to Palestinians as the Naksa, or the setback. This is because the Arab League swept in and tried to reclaim the land that had belonged to the Palestinians. But instead, the land was even further extended. The land of Israel's hegemony or rulership further extended, and it extended into the West Bank and into Gaza. And these places were then militarily occupied. And I'll get into in a minute what that means, what's meant by occupation. But the very simplified version is that these areas were now ruled by Israeli military. And this was the case until 1987, where you have civilians who are under military rule clash so intensely with Israeli troops that the first intifada is sort of sprung out of that. This is a protest against what has been happening and the occupation that the Palestinian people had been living under. And it begins in Gaza. This intifada lasts 5 years and is sort of brought to an end by the Oslo Accords in 1993. These are accords between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, later known as Fatah. And the idea is that this is the first step of a peace process. Tragically, we know now, 20 years, 30 years later, looking back, that this was not a successful peace process, but it was the beginnings of a potential peace process between the two peoples. The Oslo Accords were a movement that was then very much halted in 2000. The negotiations stalled as the second intifada began. And this intifada, this uprising, went from 2000 to 2005. This is where we see the initial catalyst was that Prime Minister Ariel Sharon went onto the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which I'll also explain momentarily. But this began the second uprising, also through the West Bank and Gaza. In 2005, the intifada comes to an end, and Israel pulls out entirely from Gaza. In 2006, Hamas is elected due to dissatisfaction with Fatah. So they're dissatisfied with Israel and they're dissatisfied with their current Palestinian leadership, so they elect Hamas instead. In 2007, because Hamas has been deemed a terrorist organization by the US, by the EU, by Israel, they decide to blockade Gaza in order to stop funds and goods from reaching what was deemed a terrorist state. So from 2007 until now, for the last 16 years, Gaza has been in this state of blockade. And then in 2023, this very year, we saw the greatest loss of Palestinian life since the Second Intifada. So for the last 20 years, this has been the year of the greatest loss of life. I'm now going to explain a little bit more about Hamas. It was a political party that originated from Gaza and was formed in 1987. Mind you, the people in Gaza were refugees from 1948 until 1987, and these deeply dissatisfied people then acted out in the first Intifada. They reacted against the government. Hamas narrowly won a political election against Fatah then in 2006. And this election is really what moves us into the current state of affairs. There has not been a democratic election since then. And it's important to note, it's very important to note that the 2006 elections now would have been 16 years ago. Half of Gaza's population is under the age of 18 as we speak now. That's nearly 1 million people in Gaza are under the age of 18. So that means half of Gaza's population wouldn't have almost been alive during these elections, but definitely wouldn't have been able to vote. It's important also for me to reiterate, if it hasn't been reiterated enough in the news, that Hamas is not synonymous with Palestine, nor is it synonymous with Palestinians. Hamas operates out of Gaza, and Fatah, or the PA, is really the ruling party in the West Bank. The US government deemed Hamas a terrorist organization in 1997, and this is why Gaza has been blockaded, because it is deemed as a terrorist organization running a state, and the US does not send goods or services to states like this. And finally, it just is important to note that there are human rights abuses that have occurred under Hamas, and there is a lack of freedom of speech under Hamas. These are very real issues, but it's also important to note the context around those issues. So I'm now going to move on to what is the occupation. You've heard me say the occupation. I'm sure you've heard many people say it in regards to Gaza. You might have heard the phrase illegal occupation in a protest that you have seen or in the news. So I want to explain that shortly. The occupation is a term according to international humanitarian law. This is when a territory is placed under the authority of another territory. So the people in Palestine are being occupied by Israel. They are not Israelis, they are Palestinian, but they are being governed or militarily kind of seen over by Israel. I've heard people use the term military occupation. Palestinian friends of mine will use the term administrative occupation for things like checkpoints or limiting your visa status or blocking you from accessing a hospital. These are all ways that the occupation currently exists. And details, rules, and duties of occupation exist due to international law. And so occupation is meant to be brief. It's not meant to last 50 years. It's also not meant, you're meant to sort of keep your status as a citizen, and that isn't supposed to diminish under an occupation or under an occupying force. We know from watching Palestine that this has not been the case. And so people have deemed the way that Israel has occupied as illegal. So that's why we're using the phrase illegal occupation sometimes, or that's why we might see that being used. I have some photos here. The top photo is a photo of people being ID'd and checked in the city of Nablus. If you've been to Nablus, you'll know it is a beautiful town. Dear friends of mine live there. It's a troubled town, and these are soldiers stopping people on their way in to check their IDs. And this sort of limits the flow of traffic hugely in the West Bank. And just another way it makes life somewhat very uncomfortable. The bottom picture is the Bethlehem checkpoint, which you'll know if you visited the Church of the Nativity, because you have to clear a checkpoint. This checkpoint is one that is totally full as Palestinians try to go into Jerusalem to work, which is a very frequent issue we're seeing. Now, this is just this is an amazing quote. Cardinal Pizzaballa, who is the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, said on September 28th, just shortly before the war began, or before this crisis began, Gaza is a prison, an open prison. 2 million people packed inside there with a very difficult economic and social perspective for the future. The situation in Gaza was untenable, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what the Gaza blockade is with this, great infographic. This explains how the blockade really works. So here we see Gaza surrounded. At the very bottom part of this picture, you can see the border with Egypt and the Rafah crossing, which has become a very prominent point of conversation since this crisis has begun. But then you can see the red dotted line all the way across is where Gaza shares a border with Israel. You can also see into the sea that then there is a full blockade around, and the blockade goes, in a full circle around Gaza. There are walls on all parts of Gaza. There is a crossing called Eretz Crossing at the north side of this photo. And this is a crossing controlled entirely by Israel. So on the left, you can see Palestinian workers trying to get into Israel to work. This is very frequent. I believe the number is close to 10,000 people enter Gaza or enter Israel on a daily basis in order to work. And so Gazans are constantly crossing this border, and it's hugely, hugely challenging and very administrative. And we have worked with people who have needed critical healthcare in the West Bank. They have to cross this checkpoint and go across Israel, meaning they also need a permission slip essentially from Israel. And these things can be limited or not be given. So this is sort of the situation in Gaza. The blockade means that goods have not been able to enter. So food, electric, new development is very, very challenging. These are all issues facing citizens in Gaza due to the fact that Hamas is ruling, and Hamas has been deemed a terrorist organization. So this blockade has been in place again for the last 16 years. This explains the electricity crisis. In April, the power plant was shut down. I believe it started working again briefly, and it's been shut down again. But this shows how the electricity is directed into Gaza. It comes 80% from Israel, 20% from Egypt. Like I said, they kind of share a border. And since this crisis has started, electricity has been turned off for Gaza, so no electricity is coming from Israel. Additionally, all of the crossings have been closed. So like I showed you with this photo, no food could enter. As you can see, there's no great source for fresh water. So the Mediterranean gets desalinated for fresh drinking water for the citizens of Gaza, or it comes from the state of Israel. And Israel has cut off that water. It's been turned back on, but without electricity, so it's hard to pump. And with desalination plants down, salt water getting pumped to a desalination plant, which cannot run because of the lack of electricity, it does nothing for the citizens. So we're at a crux point. We've been at this point now for nearly the entirety of the crisis that the blockade has been. Goods have been blocked from entering the blockade at all. And we'll get into that later, but this is important background to know if you're going to understand why it's such a crisis that citizens in Gaza can't get food or water right now. I want to touch quickly on the current government of Israel. Again, I know these elements can feel like a bombardment of information, but it's important that you know all of these information pieces before we get back to kind of the crux of the crisis. The current government in Israel is a right-wing government that has defended settler incursions. It is headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu. The top picture where you see SOS is photos of the democratic protests that have been happening throughout Israel for the entirety of 2023. It's not important that I get into exactly why that's happening. It's very interesting, but it's not relevant. But citizens of Israel have been rising up and demanding that these judicial overhauls that the state has been trying to get through, they're trying to stop them and working against what Netanyahu's government is doing. Then the bottom photo is protests in Jerusalem that have been happening as a response to the war, as a response to the lack of ability to seemingly free the hostages, and a response to the intensity of the bombardment onto Gaza from the Israeli forces. So the people of Israel are not hugely satisfied with this government. And it's important to note that when we say that the government of Israel is doing these things, that does not inherently mean that the people of Israel stand behind that government. There are also phenomenal Israelis who do not stand behind their government. I only say phenomenal because I love them. Dear friends of mine who are actively protesting the degradation of human rights for Palestinians that we've been seeing over 2023. So this is just an important note to make. And I've heard the argument from Jewish protesters in the US that it's somewhat anti-Semitic to say all Jewish people stand behind the government of Israel. So this is some background behind that. Now I'm going to explain what are settlers and what is the West Bank in relation to settlement. So settlers are people that move from Israel into Palestine, and they create essentially small enclaves to live in. So on this left, you can see the Peace Now's count of settlements kind of throughout the West Banks. This is in 2019. This number has only grown. But in the midst of what's happening in Gaza right now, there has been an increase in settler violence in the West Bank. And this settler violence has been being perpetuated through the entirety of 2023. According to the UN, there are 700,000 settlers in the West Bank, which is nearly 10% of Israel's Jewish or Messianic Jewish population living in the West Bank, which is just a really jarring statistic. And this just creates really muddled lines of delineation between what is Palestine and what is Israel, and makes the peace process all the harder to achieve. And so it's important that we understand settlers. This bottom picture is a picture of Israeli Defense Forces alongside settlers, and all are holding guns. We hear from our partners on the ground in Palestine all the time how intense the fear of settlers are right now, and they seem to be backed by the Israeli Defense Forces and backed by this government. So I just wanted to make sure people knew what this meant when people say settler violence is on the rise. Settler attacks in Palestine were 3 per day for 2023, and this was either violent attacks on people where they were injured, or violent attacks on people's land where the land was destroyed or burned or a home was demolished. These sort of events are those that happen under settler violence. And sorry, that number is up now to 8 events per day, and seemingly only growing. I believe this is the final element I want to just quickly summarize before we get back to the current crisis, which is Al-Aqsa Mosque, or Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, as some call it. This is the heart of Palestine, if I can describe it that way. This is, for many people, the beating soul of this land. This is in the old city of Jerusalem. So that yellow picture is a map of Jerusalem, and it's in the bottom right corner. If you've gotten the chance to be in Jerusalem, you've hopefully gotten to see the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif. It's stunning. And this is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. But it is not only important for Muslim Palestinians, it's also hugely important for Christian Palestinians, because this is an identity symbol. On the left of the picture is where the Wailing Wall runs. And this is a site that has been contested and has been being fought against for the last year in a really brutal way. There have been incursions onto the compound, which the kind of rule was that everyone can visit, but only Muslims can pray, because this is their holy site. And when I described earlier the second Intifada, I said it began because of Ariel Sharon stepping onto the Temple Mount and sort of parading there. That's what I'm discussing. This is the Temple Mount. This is Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the site of that. And 2023 has been a horrific year for incursions from people going onto the compound, be them settlers or Israeli ministers. We've also seen the Israeli Defense Forces burst into Al-Aqsa Mosque in the midst of Ramadan, which is one of the holiest holidays. It's been tragic to watch this symbol and this place of religious significance be brought so deeply into this conflict and seen as sort of irrelevant to the international community. It's clearly not irrelevant for Palestinians. So on the top, you can see a photo of a man being beaten during Ramadan. And on the right of the screen is a group of Israelis holding, or of Jewish peoples holding Sukkot materials for their holiday in October 4th of this year. So this was just days before the tragedy of October 7th. And these incursions continued to happen without rebuke, without reproach. And it's been a very painful element of this year for many Palestinians. And now I just want to center back to the human lives that have been lost. Palestinian and Israeli alike, there have been so many lives lost. But the lives that have been lost on the Palestinian side have been immense and seemingly somewhat uncounted for. And so this is what we're trying to fight. We're trying to say these lives matter. This is nearly 7,000 deaths since 2008. And it's important to center back to why this matters, why it matters that there is a holistic end to this conflict. So on October 7th, I hope I've explained a few of these elements. We have the air raid sirens in Jerusalem, the naming it Al-Aqsa flood, defending Al-Aqsa. I explained the compound, the hostages taken, the individuals killed, and the Hamas gunmen entering Israel. Why that matters, because there is a fence all the way around Gaza. I'd just like to read a small element from a CMEP statement that came out on October 7th. It says, the actions of Hamas and the Israeli response in Gaza in no way advance peace, but rather continue loss of life and harm, grief and devastation, not only to the individuals affected, but also to the legitimate cause of the Palestinian people in seeking an end to the decade-long occupation and the blockade of the Gaza Strip. Throughout this year, CMEP and allies have urgently been calling attention to the evolving context characterized by escalating levels of violence between settlers, soldiers, and Palestinians. The increased nationalism and radicalization within Israeli society have led to more frequent and numerous incidents of hatred, racialized tensions, settler attacks, and incursions onto Muslim and Christian holy sites such as Stella Maris Monastery in Haifa and the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. These realities are not justifications, but have long been ignored by the international community, including the longstanding frustration and desperation of the Palestinian people who seek an end to the oppression and the occupation, and Israeli desires for lack of fear and for security. It is time for the US and the international community to strengthen efforts to de-escalate the systemic violence that has gone on for decades. This statement is longer, and we call for several elements. We have a number of statements since then, but I think this well summarizes the points I've been trying to make, which is there are no justifications for what happened October 7th, but the context has been ignored prior to this event. And it's important that we know the context. So since October 7th, I just wanted to write down this war budget because it's sort of shocking. The IDF's annual budget is around 23.6 billion as of 2023. This surpasses the total military spending of Egypt, Iran, Lebanon, and Jordan combined. The US's military assistance to Israel last fiscal year was worth $3.8 billion. That accounted for roughly 16% of Israel's military budget. I've heard some people ask me, just kind of point blank, why are you meddling in foreign politics? What do Americans have to do with foreign politics? And I just want to reiterate that America is intimately tied to the situation in Israel. As our executive director, Dr. Meili Cannon, has said, we're intimately tied to the soul of Gaza and to what happens. 16% of Israel's military budget is coming from our taxpayer dollars. And this should matter to us. The Israeli government estimated with Gaza that the war will cost roughly $246 million a day. So every day that this does not end. I believe the estimate is about 350 Palestinian lives are ended, and $246 million are spent in Israel towards what is happening in Gaza. It's unbelievable. And we can't know, I just want to state, we can't know how much Hamas has spent so far on this war, on these efforts, but I think that I really want to stress the US's role in Israel's military presence in Gaza right now. This picture on the left is just a pretty jarring image of, I believe it is Gaza City. And on the top, you can see what this area looked like prior to the bombings and the attacks on Gaza by the Israeli forces. And at the bottom, you can see what that area looks like now, which is nearly entirely leveled. This is pretty jarring, and this sort of destruction of large city blocks is happening all across Gaza right now. But more importantly, nearly 10,000 Palestinians have been killed so far in Gaza and the West Bank. The number, I believe right now as it stands, is over 1,400 Israelis have been killed. So the total loss of human life is well over 11,500 lives have ended. And this is in Gaza and the West Bank, the number that I have in bold here. The West Bank has been from settler attacks and from the Israeli Defense Forces in the West Bank. This statistic from Save the Children, 3,195 children killed in the last 3 weeks, surpasses the annual number of children killed in conflict zones since 2019. It's 1,000 children a week. That's horrific. The electricity, the food, and most of the water are still cut in Gaza, meaning that citizens are running out of time. And we are hearing from the Red Crescent and the International Red Cross that the risk of cholera at this point is not if, but when. The risk of waterborne illnesses because of the lack of sanitation, the risk of people running out of food, the issue that's being caused by electricity being cut being that there cannot be further desalination of water, and that hospitals cannot operate basic machinery. These are all huge issues facing the people of Gaza right now as we speak. This is not in the past, this is not in the future, this is at this moment in time. People in Gaza do not have food, electricity, or running water. You may have heard that the water was turned back on, but the pipes were damaged in the bombing, and also the desalination issue is a major concern. So far, since the 21st of October, we've seen 227 relief trucks enter into Gaza. This is, I have this statistic here. It's fairly jarring. There should have been on a normal scale, before the war, there were approximately 2,100 commercial trucks should have gone into Gaza in this same time. So this is about 10% of what Gaza was used to prior to a war, prior to the people being displaced and prior to their people being killed or sick. 1.5 million people in Gaza are displaced. That's out of 2 million. So 75% of Gaza is currently displaced. The US has supported Israel and has thrown in caveats that it still wants to protect citizens, but with nearly 10,000 people that have been killed, we at CMEP are saying it's not enough. And as we continue giving money to what's happening, it's just furthering this atrocity and loss of human life. But we still have 200 Israelis and foreign nationals that are still held hostage in Gaza. And we have families all across Israel mourning the loss of their loved ones as well. This crisis extends outside of Gaza. It extends into Israel. It extends into the West Bank. No man is an island in this conflict. So I want to get to, finally, before I take questions, what can you do? How can you act? I hope I've made it somewhat clear that as Americans, we do have a part to play in this. Living in Israel, in Palestine, I've gotten to hear over and over how important America is and the disappointment when the American government fails the people of both Israel and Palestine. And we are failing them now. And so I would like to say that there are things you can do. At CMEP, we're saying stand in the gap by giving, acting, and praying. You can give to organizations that are working for advocacy. You can give to development organizations in Gaza, or those that are helping heal what is broken in the kibbutzim around Gaza right now, the Israeli families. You can also join on Wednesdays. CMEP is doing a prayer every week, so we welcome you to join for those 30 minutes as we lament together and we pray for an end. On Thursdays from 10 to 10:30, we're doing a weekly briefing. So if you're interested in knowing more on a weekly basis, these are very in-depth, and it kind of can help you sift through what's false and what's real. We also have curriculum that goes into the past 100 years, and we would love to explain that to you and do that curriculum alongside you or your community. So if you're interested in that, all of that is on cmep.org. My email is lauren@cmep.org. I can put it in the chat, or maybe Thomas can, but you are welcome to email me directly and ask me anything, or ask me about any of these issues. And also so grateful to Mary Knoll for having me here, because Mary Knoll is currently calling, inviting you to call on your representatives and those in the White House alongside them. So there's a small link here, but we know from experience that these calls matter and that calls from constituents matter to your representatives. So I really encourage you to play a part here and to be a part of the change and to help the citizens of Gaza who are right now waiting for the US to act differently. So thank you so much again for having me. I'm excited to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for a wonderful and comprehensive and excellent overview of a very tough situation. And plenty of questions. I don't know if we'll have time for every single one, but we'll work our way through. The first question is, how do we navigate an environment in which the story you have shared can be deemed unpatriotic or anti-Semitic?
I appreciate this question. I think it's so thoughtful. I think that it's a challenging thing. I was very stressed coming to share this with you all. I'm a little scared to share it with my home community. I understand that this environment that we're sharing these in is incredibly tense. But I also think it's our duty as Christians to share. And I think that if we're talking more from or just, people who know what's going on, we can't be silent. And so I think it's important to highlight that disagreeing with the actions of Israel does not make you anti-Semitic. I know amazing, beautiful Jewish peoples in and outside of Israel who deeply disagree with what's happening right now and the way that it's being responded to. And I think that's an important point to stress. But I also think it's important to stress that there are Palestinian Americans who live in Gaza or who live in America, and we're representing them by sharing their story. Palestinians also deserve to be supported. And I think it's important to challenge this rhetoric by saying, does one human life matter more than another? Does the life of a Palestinian American matter more than the life of an Israeli American? And so that to me is just an important distinction to make.
I have another question here for you. This one's a tough one. Why isn't Egypt doing more to allow people to cross out of Gaza?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I expected to get because this question has been asked a lot right now. The very short version is Gaza is currently it's a place that is housing people who are refugees from 1948, and those people don't want to leave. They don't want to become further refugees. And so while Egypt could do more to open their borders and allow Palestinians in, actually Palestinians in Gaza don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to leave their land. There's a feeling that leaving your land is like leaving your family behind. There is a hugely sort of passed down element to the land here in Palestine. And so it's important to realize that the people don't want to leave necessarily. But it's also important to realize that Egypt does not feel it is their entire responsibility and feels that they need to serve as a mediator right now. And to open their borders entirely makes them less of a mediator and more of a full recipient. And so I also think that there's this desire to appropriately respond to what the Palestinian people want and need. And while it might feel short-term like a solution that the people be allowed to leave, I think both Egypt and the people in Gaza see that short-term solution very quickly becoming a long-term solution, as happened in Gaza.
How can you share, how can we work on college campuses about the disagreements we've been seeing there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a coworker who is currently on the Harvard campus, and that's been one that has seen, a lot of tragic events recently. I think it's really important that no matter which where you want to stand on this, that you don't do so in hate. And I think that unfortunately what I've been seeing is kind of side taking and fighting one side versus another. This is not a football game. This is not a pick your team. This is human lives on the table and human rights that are being discussed. And so it's problematic to me on all sides, if you want to call it sides, when I see people shouting hate. And I have seen that in the videos I've seen from certain protests or on college campuses. How to promote listening and understanding is a question I want to know more widely across American society right now, how we can better do that. But even more so when it's an element like Palestine, like Israel, where we've seen these debates being had for the last 40 years inside American society with little avail. So if you have thoughts how we can better do this, I'm interested in hearing them too. But I just think at this point in time, it's further educating, welcoming discussion, doing so in a loving format, and doing so in a way that says, I hear your concerns and I would like to raise my own. You can say that it is absolutely right that Jewish people have a safe place to call home, and also say that Palestinians deserve those same rights.
And somewhat relatedly, what do you think of Pope Francis's call for ceasefire, and how can the Catholic Church be helpful?
I think that His Holiness Pope Francis has really, I'm just inspired by the amount that his call for a ceasefire, his call for a day of fasting. I have to say that my love for the Catholic Church has grown so hugely in my past year in the Middle East, seeing the amazing people who are doing work there on the ground. So I really admire this call for a ceasefire, and I echo it. I think Mary Nolan and CMEP are both standing alongside Pope Francis as we call for a ceasefire. And the need for a ceasefire is so huge right now because there's so much need for food, for water, for electricity, for these things to enter the country, and they cannot do so while there is bombardment, or the amount that they can do so is so limited. And so we're seeing hospital staff crying out and begging for medical equipment and for food for their patients, for desperately needed water in areas of Gaza where we are seeing 1.5 million people sort of clustered together. And the amount of trucks that have entered are just not even a drop in the bucket for what should have entered at this point. So I kind of have gone off on a tangent, but just to say, I echo his call, and I think that we should heed it.
This is a somewhat smaller question, but what is the difference between a ceasefire and a pause?
From maybe Thomas, you can shed light on this, but from my understanding, this is a semantic difference. This is a politically charged space now, and ceasefire has been claimed to be hateful or hate speak. And so now people are entering and calling it a pause, or like I'm not even sure the other words that have been being discussed about this. I was telling Thomas earlier, living not in the States, sometimes I'm out of the loop on these sort of semantic differences that enter political scenes or different news articles. But Both are calling for a stopping in the bombing of Gaza and the stopping of sending rockets out of Gaza into southern Israel, and saying this has to occur in order for desperately needed supplies to enter Gaza.
Here's a question. Where do the 1.5 million Gazans go when they're displaced?
Oh, that question, that makes me want to cry. Most of the people right now are in UN schools and in hospitals. They are sheltering in, the UN has said we do not have room for these people to stay here. But Israel is I believe it is considered a humanitarian law violation to bomb a school that has been created by the UN. And so these are sort of protected spaces, these schools and these hospitals. And so the people are sheltering there, and the UN is saying these people are sleeping outside on the streets. They're sleeping everywhere. There are not homes for them to stay in. So people are huddling together. And I wish I could pull up the map right now, but the north of Gaza is really the populated area of Gaza. Southern Gaza doesn't even have the infrastructure to house even close to this many people. So they're fleeing to areas that are open farmland. So people are in desperate situations right now, and the land gets colder and colder by day. And so the fact that children and women are sleeping outside every night should haunt us and cause us to take action.
Here's a question. What do we do about the fact that Hamas is hiding behind their citizens, keeping Palestinians from fleeing, or taking up in hospitals or in schools?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I'm not sure I have a great, succinct answer for you on that. It's something that I think, as people working towards humanitarian rights and aid, that's hugely troubling, those claims. And obviously we can't totally test the validity of them. We're having a hard time getting any information out of Gaza right now with the limited electricity and the limited internet that we're seeing. But I would say even in the midst of Hamas, there are citizens, and those citizens' lives don't get discounted because of what Hamas may or may not be doing. And that is an important distinction to make, is even if the situation is happening that Hamas is hiding in hospitals, injured humans are also in those hospitals. And I don't believe that bombing the hospitals to get Hamas out makes it so that those civilian lives aren't real, don't exist, aren't there. And I just also want to reiterate on this point that this sort of issue of there's nowhere to go, all of Gaza is just sort of mazes and it's all militarized and all of these things, it has to be decimated, is such a far cry from what is deserved by the civilians of Gaza, what is deserved by the million children that are living in Gaza. And furthermore, the idea that this just we have to bring it to an end once and for all, and then these problems won't arise again. This is sort of a rhetoric that's been occurring for the last 60 odd years. And the idea that violence will end the violence is so troubling to me, because we're just seeing a perpetuation of the cycle instead of seeing an end to the violence. And it just seems that there's such a clear need for a holistic end to this crisis, far more outside of just this immediate crisis with Israel and Hamas, but the larger conflict at large that groups like Mary Knoll and CMEP have been advocating for years. There's clearly a need for something to change.
Would Israel allow refugees from Gaza to pass into safe zones in Israel?
The short answer, I think, would be no. We see Palestinian citizens of Israel who are living right now in Israel, that there's sort of this, they call them sometimes 49 Palestinians, like the year 49, and these are Palestinians who never left their homes. A lot of these Palestinians live in northern Israel, in cities like Nazareth or in Haifa. And there's been a strong increase in racism towards these Palestinians. We've heard of school teachers who have been being fired or at least told to stay home for a little while in the midst of this crisis. We've also seen an uptick in violence across the West Bank. We've seen violence and racism at universities in Israel. People are expressing any sort of solidarity with the civilians of Gaza. They are being removed from their universities. So I would say Israel is not at a point right now where it wants to welcome safe havens in its own society. It cannot even currently protect its own citizens of Israel who identify as Palestinians. So I don't believe it's at a point where it would be ready to accept Palestinian citizens of Gaza.
This one's a tough one. The ambassador from Palestine to the UK was unable to state that the October 7th attack was a horrific event. How can leaders help to pursue peace?
Yeah, this is a good question and a really tricky question to answer right on the spot. I think what's challenging right now is that a lot of people say, I don't agree at all with how these actions played out, but I agree with the fact that I'm dissatisfied with the situation in Gaza, or I agree with the fact that I think settler violence is wrong. And so some people are agreeing with elements of the larger issue playing out in Gaza, even if they firmly disagree with how Hamas has enacted these events and how October 7th happened and the absolute catastrophe that has faced Israel since. And I think it's important to note that while Palestinians in the West Bank, dear friends of mine, don't support Hamas, they also want an end to the occupation. And this is creating a real semantic challenge, I think, within Palestine of how can we say we do want an end to the occupation while also saying this should not have happened on October 7th. And it's creating a situation where people are sort of virtue signaling about calling it a terrorist attack or calling it a violent event or calling it, all of these sort of phrases. So while I understand that this is hugely disquieting, that someone wasn't allowed to call it a terrorist attack, I also think that there's larger context that's necessary for a lot of these, and for a lot of these politicians. They're given, one chance to state their claim, and that's it. And I think that that's creating an issue here too in the US and abroad. So I'm not sure if I answered that question, Thomas, but you can feel free to add.
Well, let's end on this question here. What are some organizations that are working towards peace? Jewish, Muslim, Christians in Israel and Palestine?
That's a great question. So there are some amazing groups working in Israel, amazing groups that we work alongside who are trying to bring about change within Israeli society. Some of those groups include Hamoked, who fight for Palestinian human rights inside of Israel and also Israeli human rights. B'Tselem, who you might be familiar with, groups like Peace Now, who shine light on Palestinian groups who are in the West Bank. That there are groups that are working towards these rights, and also groups that are working right now to sort of care for families in the sort of southern Israel area, in these kibbutzim, which are farms, if you're unfamiliar with that term, that have been attacked by Gaza. Women Wage Peace is an amazing Israeli group who is made of Israeli women. And I believe one of the women that's part of Women Wage Peace might actually currently be a hostage. So it's a very complex group and really a beautiful testament to the power of religious Jewish women fighting for peace. Inside of Palestine, there are a lot of groups working actually within Israel and Palestine still. The Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem is my home diocese, so I'm going to shout them out. But they own Al Ahli Hospital, and so you can give to restoring that hospital. There's also the Red Crescent or the Red Cross that has been dealing with a lot of the hospital traumas that have been going in. The UN is one of the main groups advocating for bringing in trucks. But then there's also a need outside of immediate developmental work for long-term change. And that's where I'm encouraged by the work that our organization, CMEP, the work that Mary Knoll, that we've been doing together and separately, to advocate for long-term change. This cannot happen again. This cannot keep happening. And I think Mary Knoll and CMEP are both saying this is enough. And so I really want to say that, short-term relief is necessary and long-term change is necessary in the midst of this. And so I hope that those are helpful.
I think I'd said that that'd be the last question, but I saw another one and I'd like to cover it. I also wanted to say that Al Ali hospital was bombed and hundreds lost their lives there. So certainly want to keep organizations like such as those in our thoughts and prayers. And the last question then, is it realistic for Israel to believe that it can destroy and eliminate Hamas? And what would replace Hamas to truly represent the Palestinians?
Is it possible to believe they could? They could, hypothetically, but I don't believe it's actually realistic to believe this could happen. I think the history of Gaza shows that extremism breeds extremism, and lack of voice breeds a desire to show your voice, even if it's through violent means. I think that we've seen just a perpetuation of violence happening in the West Bank and in Gaza. I think that we can see Palestinians who, support the right to violent protest, even in the West Bank. So the idea that ending Hamas would end these sort of violent attacks, I don't think that's realistic. I think it's realistic to say the people will be satisfied when they feel they have a voice and they have human rights and they have the ability to live. I mean, these people just want to live. They want to not worry about their children dying in the same way that Israelis want to live, and they don't want to worry about sending their children off to war. And we've lived for 100 years with these fears, with parents holding fears of their children dying. So I don't think it's likely to believe that by ending Hamas in Gaza right now, we would end this violence against Israel, or that it would secure Israel's borders. I also think that what will replace Hamas is totally an unknown right now. There's a lot of things flying around from the US point of view, from the Israeli point of view, from the Palestinian point of view. We've heard people say the PA would replace Hamas. We've also heard the PA say, no, we wouldn't. So it's very unclear what would come. It seems like the next choice is to talk again about what a two-state solution looks like, what it actually looks like for an end to come, more long-term for Gaza, how we free people from an open-air prison and allow them to make something of their lives and to do something outside of just kind of running in a loop. And so I think when we're looking at the situation right now in Gaza and saying what comes next, that question really matters. And I think we can be advocates for saying what comes next is not further militarization, further wars, further conflict. It's de-escalation so that, as Mary Knoll says, coexistence can occur. And CMEP really advocates for a just and holistic end to this conflict. That does not mean we just say peace. It means that we say something has to change. So I hope that has answered that.
Thank you for a wonderful webinar and for sharing your time with us today. I think we've all learned and gathered a better appreciation for a very complex situation.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are over the hour, so we are going to have to shut down, but the video recording of this webinar is going to be available on our YouTube channel, and we will send a follow-up with the slides, links to what was mentioned, and places where you can go to learn more and act now.
Thank you.